Hello and welcome to The Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast for the casual spike focused on the latest decks, trends, and strategies in Modern. My name is Stanislav here in Chicago, and with me on the line from Denver, Colorado, it's the one and only Shane Beeps.
Me, I'm a real war boy, ready for this War of the Spark spoiler session, my friend.
Also with us here in Chicago, it's the Godfather, Dave Harburger.
It's me in my fourth Planeswalker printing form, Harbarger the Masterless.
How dare you? How dare you step on my toes, Dave?
Sorry.
Last but not least, it's the warden in town, Zach Culhan.
As previewed by my fellow co-host, we will be talking about a certain Masterless Planeswalker later today.
On this week's episode, we break down the results from Grand Prix Yokohama. Then we dive into our favorite cards from War of the Spark and revisit tips on spoiler season card evaluation. Finally, we wrap up the episode with a tournament report from a Modern 2K I played in this weekend. But first, some housekeeping. It wouldn't be a dive down if we didn't thank our awesome fans. So we want to start out the show with a shout out to everyone who took the time to respond to our Patreon survey. Your input has been super helpful as we figured out how to structure our Patreon tiers. The survey is now closed, and the Patreon is officially slated to launch within the next week or two. We'll definitely let you know on the show when that's up and running, but if you are dying to give us your money as soon as possible, keep an eye out on our Twitter, and we'll post there once the Patreon is ready to go. You can find us on Twitter at TheDiveDown, all one word.
So speaking of Twitter, thank you to everyone who has replied to our request for more questions. We have a document going with all of those, and we look forward to answering them when we can. If you have a question for the show or just want to ask us about anything in Modern in general, we'd love to hear from you. So keep the questions coming. You can talk to us on Twitter, on Reddit, on Gmail, wherever you see us.
Yeah, you can email us, thedivedown@gmail.com. Finally, we've got some iTunes reviews that we want to acknowledge. Shout out to friends of the show, Veneer. I think that's how that is pronounced. Sepia Flux. Love that name. And also Heath. We appreciate you. For everyone else, if you like what you hear, we hope you consider leaving us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, and those are super helpful in helping us find new fans. So thanks again to everyone who's done that in the past, and thanks in advance to everyone who's going to do it in the future. So now we're going to jump into the breakdown, but Dave has to take a quick leave of absence. But you'll be back for the dive down, right, buddy?
Yeah, I'm being exiled until the beginning of the next turn.
You're a meandering tower shell.
Exactly.
So this week we'll be looking at Grand Prix Yokohama. It was a Modern event. So it's pretty interesting. It's always neat to see other countries and how the Modern meta develops there. It's always a little distinct from the way it is in America where we're playing.
Yeah, same decks, but sometimes the individual card choices tend to be a little bit unusual from what we tend to see when we look at results in the West.
Yeah,
For sure. I don't like being stereotypical or anything like that, but it does feel like there's always something a little bit different, a little bit tweaked, a little bit more nuanced, or just a little bit different. Something fun, something spicy.
So before we go through the top 8 and pick apart some interesting card choices in the list there, let's just go over the decks that had more than one player in the top 32. So the highest number was Blue Red Phoenix, which had 6 people playing in the top 32, and the highest finish for that deck was 5th place. Humans had 5 people in the top 32, and their top finish was 13th place. We saw Boros or Red White Burn with 4 people in the top 32, and their top finish was 17th. We've seen Dredge, and we'll talk about that in a second, but Dredge was well represented at this tournament. Dredge had 3 people in the top 32, and their top finish was number 4. The Rock, or Green-Black, had 2 people in the top 32, and they managed to snag 3rd place. And then finally, in the rear is Boggles, with 2 in the top 32, but they only managed to get to 20th place. So it's interesting to note that the deck that won this tournament was not actually represented by more than one pilot overall.
Yeah, that is novel for sure. I find this interesting. Like, there's only one Green Tron in the top 32. Yeah, it surprises me that there were more Bogles players than there were Green Tron players in the room.
Yeah, I wonder if that's just one of those things where there happen to be a lot of Bogles players in the area, or maybe they just happen to play well and get good matchups. We don't really know because there wasn't a ton of coverage, and we really, as our own Dave Harburger, had to go through Twitter and translate from Japanese to English to really get some of these results early on.
Yeah, so let's talk about the top 8 here, guys.
Yeah, so first place, we see Hardened Scales Affinity as the winner. So this is a deck that we have obviously talked about in this show before. It's always been the running in Modern, and it's interesting to see it just take down a big event like this. The maybe interesting play or something that's a little uncharacteristic is the 4 Llanowar Reborn in the list.
Yeah, it seemed like it was due time for Hardened Scales to take down a tournament. Such a powerful deck. We saw it come in second place at GP LA, and it's one of those that I think we've assessed that is hard to master, but when done right, is a very powerful strategy that opponents can struggle playing against. So it's really nice to see that someone managed to really demonstrate what this deck is capable of.
Yeah, I personally wouldn't be surprised to see this have more top 32, top 16, maybe even top 8 representation next weekend at the MC. It's a very challenging deck to play really well, and it has a high power ceiling. So I wouldn't be surprised, like I said, to see some pros really play it well and take it deep into the tournament.
Yeah, way back on episode 13, me and Shane interviewed Gall about it. And there are some pretty interesting lines from there where he talked about how every turn you're doing this advanced math and trying to figure out all the outs you have, and every turn is sort of, can I win this turn? Can I go off? So it's interesting, like as Stan mentioned, it really rewards consistent play. So as more people pick up this deck and play with it, it'll be interesting to see what sort of results it has in the coming years, or in the coming months even.
Yeah, or even how it evolves.
Exactly. So in second place, we have Bant Spirits.
You guys remember how last episode I said Bant Spirits is going to make a top 4 of the Mythic Championship?
Yeah, you were just 1 week off.
And a whole continent away.
No, but I mean, it's interesting things I noted here. It has 3 main deck Deputy of Detention and no Reflector Mage. I was surprised by that. I thought that Reflector Mage would maybe be quite good right now versus a high Phoenix meta, but perhaps Deputy does the same job and is a little bit more flexible. I don't know. One thing I thought was wild, though, was the Force Selfless Spirit in the main deck. That's a lot more than typical. It's usually something like a 1 or 2 of, but maybe they were just hedging up against, destroy all creatures, wrath type metagame. I don't really know. Or like an O-Stone metagame that they were expecting.
It seems even good against the Rock, right? Like any mid-range deck that's full of removal, in addition to control decks, Selfless Spirit really helps mitigate that.
Well, you're still 1-for-1ing yourself.
Well, I think especially if you're running Deputy Detention, which is when they kill it, they get it back and get to cast more. So I think I would definitely be okay sacrificing a Selfless Spirit if they didn't get to cast their Ensnaring Bridge or didn't get to cast their thing on the ice, anything like that. And I also do think that we've seen, if not a resurgence, just a more rising to the top of green-black decks that have board wipes, and there's more blue-white control and things like that as well that are also running board wipes. Anger of the Gods is popular once again as well. So if you can hedge your bet against a card you want to protect and you know there's going to be board wipes around, it seems like maybe not a no-brainer, but a logical conclusion once you think about everything else.
I'm not sold on it, but this person did a lot better than I have.
In third place, we have a green-black rock deck. So this one isn't anything too wild or spicy. It does have 2 Nihil Spellbomb in the main, but I've been seeing more and more of those pop up 1 or 2 in list. So I think that's something that is more just becoming accepted as part of the build at this point.
Yeah, right now especially, for sure. It's basically stock.
And now we get to the first of 3 dredge decks in the top 8. So this one coming in 4th place, the tech here was Alpine Moon, 2 of them in the side. So Shane, as our resident dredgeman, how do you feel about this card?
I mean, I've mentioned this in a few episodes in the past, as I don't really love cards that you have to have in your opener to matter in dredge, or your opener like maybe the first 1 or 2 draws, right? Because after your second natural draw, you're almost never taking a natural draw again. And since you already need a good combination of cards to have in your opener to get your engine online, relying on yet another card to be part of that opener can be kind of frustrating. Playing Tron, when we were testing the London Mulligan last week, I was facing down a few Alpine Moons, and I find the card to be adequate in power level, and it does have a little bit more flexibility than just hosing Tron. But what it does do is it fixes your mana. It fixes the opposing player's mana, so which then allows them to fairly easily cast something like a Nature's Claim. So I have been stuck on green mana, had an Alpine Moon played against me, and then I was like, thanks, sir, or madam, I'm going to cast my Nature's Claim on you and then untap with Tron online. So it's not the end-all be-all, but I think it comes down pretty quickly. It's pretty flexible, but I don't know if I love it in a dredge sideboard for the reasons I mentioned earlier. Maybe with a London Mulligan, that will be something where people can mull to both the combination of cards they want plus a hate card, but in essentially what's a combo deck and something like Dredge or like Tron, I don't love having to also have a sideboard hate card that you can't cast from the graveyard in something like Dredge, where you're just milling your deck into your graveyard really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like the person must have valued this the way you would a ley line in this deck, where you just want in your opening hand and maybe you'll mulligan a couple times to get it.
Sure. And then it's one of those things where having one or two of in your deck from the sideboard, if you do happen to mill it over into your graveyard, it wasn't the end of the world. Like typically you're going to sideboard maybe 4 to 5 cards max when you're playing Dredge so that you don't ruin your engine. And if 2 of them happen to be Alpine Moon and they're not in your opener, they're just going to hit the bin eventually anyway, and it's not going to be too much of a loss of your engine's power.
So coming in 5th, we have a Blue-Red Phoenix list. This one was running a single Blood Moon main in addition to a single Maximized Velocity.
I also do think it's interesting to have the Maximized Velocity in the main, because having played a lot of Phoenix, I can tell you that sometimes when you cast a Crackling Drake, you really wish you could swing with it immediately. Although you don't often have the mana up to do that. But one thing I have noticed playing Phoenix and seeing all these Phoenix lists lately that we've discussed, basically since we've started the podcast, is there's a lot of player preference that goes into what you want in some of those tertiary slots. And that because you're running so many cantrips and you get to go through so much of your deck, I think that's what makes this strategy somewhat interesting, is that you can have certain preference slots that you can adjust based on how you want the deck to play out, because you're a little likelier to find those cards eventually.
It's interesting, that comment with a list like this and a deck like this, where the 75 for this deck is pretty close, and there's room to move around, there's room for adjustment, but like the way that you can show your unique spin is like 1 or 2 cards, right? Because the most of it, or the rest of it's figured out, and people have decided this is better than this has a higher win rate, etc. So it's just interesting to me that how you can show your flair is an Is It Charm or a Maximized Velocity or something like that.
Yeah.
So coming in 6th place, we have the second of 3 Dredge decks. This one had a Vengeful Pharaoh on the side, which I know Shane has mentioned before. A card that I played with way back in the day when I was still buying fat packs.
Yeah, it's a cool card. I mean, at the GP level, I'm sure people know what it does, but I swear I've played plenty of Dredge games at the LGS level where people don't even read when I'm putting into the graveyard, and I'm sure we get caught up by it.
I've absolutely lost to a Vengeful Pharaoh that appeared in my Dredge opponent's sideboard.
Appeared.
Yeah, I have no idea how it got there. Ended up there right when they needed it.
Coming in 7th place, we have not a dark horse contender, but something that's maybe starting to make waves and appearing more often, in Esper Control.
I have a borderline hot take that this deck is Esper Control in name only, and it's actually blue-white Miracles splashing black for like 2 cards, as opposed to what we've seen from previous Esper Control builds over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's actually being categorized as blue-white control on Goldfish.
But it's running Kaya, and it's running Unmoored Ego in the sideboard.
Yeah, but that's it. And I think what makes Esper Control, or the Esper Control deck that we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, interesting are the main deck Fatal Pushes, in addition to Kaya, but also you have tools like Nihil Spellbomb, you even have tools like Cast Down. Unmoored Ego is certainly an important card in that package, but I think missing that Esper Charm package makes this, and also having the Miracle cards in the main, along with 4 Jace, I think you're really leaning into Terminus here more than what Esper Control is doing alternatively.
So yeah, it seems more like it's a blue-white control, which is dipping into black for a small removal package or a small planeswalker package.
Guys, I don't even know how to say this card in the sideboard. Porphyry Nodes?
Porphyry Nodes is the real deal, in my opinion. It's a color-shifted drop of honey.
Yeah, so at the beginning of your upkeep, destroy the creature with the least power. It can't be regenerated. That's very important text. If 2 or more creatures are tied for least power, you choose one of them. When there are no creatures in play, sacrifice Porphyry Nodes. So, okay. Destroy the creature with least power. So it's pretty good against not very go-wide decks, yeah?
I think even against go-wide decks it has a place. Me and Stan were talking about a similar card at our LGS recently, and someone had chimed in that a card like this forces the opponent to play sort of a small mini-game, where if they want to keep committing resources to the board and slowly lose them, or hold back real quick and have things get wiped and then dump their hand.
Yeah, it buys you time, I suppose.
Exactly.
As the blue-white control player.
And there's a chance that your opponent can, make the quote-unquote wrong choice in that decision, and maybe it was smarter to just keep dumping things and applying pressure as opposed to taking a step back. So I think any card that can create more meta decisions for your opponent is good, and I particularly like this card. It's also 1 mana.
Also, to your point, Shane, that it's not bad against go-wide strategies, in part because you do have other points of removal, along with it can get rid of a board of creatures given enough time.
I do not think that this gets sideboarded in against go-wide decks, though.
I think you're probably right in that, but if you're struggling to find what to bring in against a deck like Humans or Spirits that's using Cavern of Souls to make all of your counter magic pretty weak, then Porphyry Nodes might be one of the tools that you can use in that strategy.
Yeah, you might just have to. What do you have better?
So in 8th place, we have the final 3rd Dredge deck of this top 8.
Yes, it's come to fruition, my prophecy that Dredge is underplayed and is going to start taking over the metagame, even before the London Mulligan.
Yeah. So how do we feel about this top 8, guys?
I don't like seeing 3 Dredge in the top 8. People do not like seeing that much Dredge, especially. But I think that we are going to see more Dredge at the MC, so get prepared, hold on to your butts. But it's interesting to see some rogue strategies. I mean, it is blue-white control, like Stan said. It's not something super rogue like Esper may seem. I like seeing Hardened Scales winning.
Yeah, I'm definitely not as troubled by 3 Dredge decks, just because there's always going to be, or not always, but it seems like lately there tends to be a deck that has the biggest share of the top 8 meta. I do like this particular top 8, in part because it deviates from the norm somewhat, but also demonstrates some really unique interpretations of decks that we consider otherwise stock or familiar.
I understand people's issues with Dredge. I myself have issue with Dredge, but I think if there's one deck to be the boogeyman to hate, I think that you could do a lot worse than Dredge.
For sure.
It's not easily shut down by Graveyard Hate, but Graveyard Hate is a pretty big obstacle for it to overcome. And even board wipes, especially if they can exile, are pretty bad. So I think this deck is powerful. I'm not saying it's not. I think it's definitely a contender to beat, but there are already very good and some main deckable cards that you can use to play against a strategy.
Exactly.
Yeah, not to mention, this could be an example of people recognizing what Shane did, which is Dredge is underplayed and trying to capitalize perhaps on your opponent's lack of preparedness. And
yeah, absolutely.
If that's what those players were calculating, good on them for pulling it off.
I mean, it's a sort of thing where if you don't think there's going to be a lot of Dredge, you might change a couple sideboard cards and all of a sudden your win rate goes down by 20-30% just because of how you face that day.
So guys, what do you think about a number of Boros burn decks in the top 32? After we've been seeing time and again that burn is like a sub 50% deck, even with the new tools it's getting, it's occasionally showing up in some top 16s. It's barely sniffing a top 8 lately, but all of a sudden we see people bringing it out to this tournament. Do you think they just like playing it? Do you think they saw an opportunity for it? Like, would you bring burn right now?
Sometimes I like to think about whether players are making calculated decisions about the deck that they want to bring or whether they're just bringing the 75 that they have access to. So in theory, let's say players are making calculated decisions and that's why they're playing at the GP level and making top 32 and top 8. I think that's kind of a fair assumption. Maybe part of their math was there's going to be more Tron. And what we're seeing now is not a ton of Tron. And likewise, perhaps as a result, Burn is struggling since it doesn't have that type of meta to punish.
Or maybe it punished it all the way through the top 32.
That's also possible, yeah. It's funny how tournaments can work in such a dynamic way, right? Like, depending on the meta share of the room, that can affect an entire deck's performance over the course of a weekend.
Exactly. Maybe all these Burn players got paired with their worst matchup game one. Maybe they all played Soul Sisters, right? And everyone's just started off X1 because of that.
Hey, sister, soul sister, come play Control, sister.
So I will speak as a Burn player. I think the deck is at a very good power level right now. I know it's not putting up a ton of results, but I think it's better than it has been in a long time, thanks to both the printing of Skewer the Critics and Light Up the Stage.
Sure.
So I think the deck has gotten a power bump. I don't think it's super easy to play, but I think it's easier compared to some other decks. And I think that it's also pretty affordable. So it's easy to have all these cards. There's not too many lines, so it's sort of easy to sort of remember good plays or figure out where you are. And like I said, the power bump is there. So I think there are a couple factors making it more attractive to bring to a tournament.
Yeah, and so many players, I think including the members of this podcast, have played Burn at some point in their Magic career, and it's just so easy to just pick up and dust off your old Burn deck. Who doesn't want to play Burn every once in a while? Let's play some Burn. Let's light some things on fire. Let's play Burn, guys. I want to cast Burn spells. Let's cast Burn.
Bolt you.
Bolt you.
Bolt.
Rift Bolt, Bolt you, Lava Spike, go.
3/5 drop.
Yeah. That's called the winner's bracket.
All right, fellas, that was fun. Thank you for joining me on this breakdown. Now we are going to take a short break. Dave is going to jump back onto the podcast, and we're going to do a dive down into our favorite picks from War of the Spark. Stay with us. So something that we touch on frequently, not every episode, is how to look at cards through different lenses for Modern specifically. And I think that's such an important skill to have that is really hard to develop. I really love that we're going to do a quick refresher on that and how to look at spoiler season and individual cards and figure out how and where or when or why you might be able to find a place for them in Modern.
And who better to do that than the Godfather, the man who guides us all, the experienced David Harbarger.
Well, you guys aren't putting too much weight on my shoulders with that intro, I guess. But I think it's just a good time to refresh people on the way that we kind of try to think about spoilers when we're talking about them with each other during spoiler season, because that is what we're doing right now. We're going to do a little bit of our favorite spoilers from War of the Spark. But the fact is, we can't talk about every card that we think is great. And we also won't necessarily get every card that you think is great. And that's okay. What we want to make sure we do here at the Dive Down is also equip you with some tools to be able to figure out how to do things yourself, or how to contribute to things in our Reddit thread or things like that, so we can have an ongoing discussion with you about the cards that you think are interesting too. So what are some easy ways to think about how a spoiled card can be evaluated for Modern play? So the way I think about this, and we talked about this on episode 5 when we were talking about Ravnica Allegiance, is that I think it's basically there's 3 filters to think about when you're looking at Modern. Cost, power level, and fit. Okay?
Yeah.
So we're going to start with cost. We're going to go through each one of these really fast because we don't want to delay getting to the spoilers too long. But let's talk a little bit about what we mean by cost. So cost, of course, we're referring to converted mana cost. This is the biggest factor for Modern, right? When I review cards on the spoiler, I always start low when I'm thinking about cards that could be potentially good for Modern. I go through and I honestly look for any 0 casting cost cards or any 1 mana casting cost cards first, just to see if there's anything that gets kind of like swept up in that net on like a broad kind of evaluation.
If something's like a 5 CMC or more, I almost immediately just filter it out, unless it's like a Planeswalker or something that when it was spoiled in the first place, people went absolutely ape.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that's a good thing to think, is that those cards have a really much bigger kind of level of power to clear. And so we'll talk about that one in kind of the next section. But the deal with it is that it's 0, 1, or 2, or it's kind of like where you want to start for Modern. You want to look for cards that have cost-reducing conditions in the text or cost-reducing mechanics in the set. So think about things like Spectacle from the last set. So there were multiple cards from that mechanic alone that we knew immediately we're going to see play in Modern because the condition to trigger it was not that hard, and it reduced it to a 1 mana cost.
The card that comes to mind right away is Skewer the Critics, a card that all of us saw and went, Brent's probably going to use this card. As we mentioned in the last segment, Burn is indeed using this card.
Yep, and Light Up the Stage, for example, is really similar. The other card that comes to mind, of course, for this is Arclight Phoenix, which is a card that has the rules on it of how to break it. Hollow One is another card that's like this. It has a mechanic that tells you how to reduce its cost to 0. I think one thing to keep in mind, too, is that different permanents have different cost thresholds for meriting a look on their own. So I think of it this way, that a spell, you usually want to look at spells that cost 0 or 1 mana. Creatures, you want to look at creatures that cost 1 or 2 mana. And then Planeswalkers, the threshold seems to be around 3. Again, this isn't kind of like a hard and fast rule, but the first time I look through a spoiler, when I see the complete list of cards in a new set, the first thing I do is look for all the cheap spells.
Sure.
The next filter I use when I look at cards for evaluation for Modern is power level, right? This is the quality of evaluation that's the easiest to see on a card, but it's the hardest part to get right in isolation because so many conditions need to be met in order to have a powerful card see play in Modern. So basically, if a card is new, powerful and able to warp the game around it, it merits having a look at it.
Yeah, but predicting what warp is the challenging part.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. I think this really harkens back to a few episodes ago when we talked about cards that we thought were almost there but not quite, where it's very easy to misjudge a card right away. As I mentioned with Sarkhan Fireblood, I thought that card was going to break my deck open and make it a new tier in Modern, and it is not even played currently. So it's very difficult to analyze these cards.
Yeah. And I think that this applies to everything. It's spells, permanents, et cetera, et cetera. Although I do think that on power level alone, it's quite often a permanent of some kind that really kind of draws your attention to it for this particular bucket.
Yeah, I really look at removal a lot through these first two lenses that you outlined here, Dave. Like, because you have to balance the cost with the power level. And that's kind of every card, right? But I was specifically thinking about things like, modern level removal from recent sets are things like Fatal Push and Assassin's Trophy, right? Where Fatal Push costs 1, hits a huge number of popular threats in Modern. Assassin's Trophy costs 2, requires black and green mana, but it's so flexible that it's almost always seen in some number in BGX decks now, even with the mana wrap it provides to the opponents. But then you look at something like Bedevil from Ravnica Allegiance. It's likely not going to see Modern play because it's 3 CMC. It has rougher mana requirements and less popular colors, doesn't hit everything that Trophy does. So that's kind of something where you're like, okay, well, this is 3 CMC. Is it powerful enough? Probably not.
I do think it's worth noting that a card like Bedevil does fit into the category of cards to keep on your watch list, because 3 mana is a lot, but if that color combination gets more support or sees more play, that's a card that can all of a sudden rise from obscurity to prevalence.
Yeah, so power level is really splashy, and that's the fun part of reading, but you got to try to keep real when you're looking at the power level of cards on a spoiler, because it really relates to the converted mana cost, and it also relates to the next kind of lens that I look at cards for Modern, and that's fit. So where is this card going to go? And I think that's way, way more important than people also ascribe to when they just look at cards in isolation. And so a couple of things to think about when thinking about where a card fits in. There's some easy kind of rules you can use to see if a card fits in somewhere easily, or if it could fit in somewhere that's kind of building something new on its own. So the first thing is a card that obviously slots into an existing archetype, right? So Shane mentioned Assassin's Trophy a moment ago. I think that's a card that improved on a number of different removal options that were available to black-green decks, right? Because it let them hit lands suddenly, where other cards that they were playing at the time, things like Abrupt Decay, didn't. So it's a value card that immediately improved on a card that was already in play. So it was something that was a new option or appropriate for a different meta. Now, it's going to go back and forth, I think, for a long time on how many Abrupt Decays versus how many Assassin's Trophies you should play, but now we know that that is an option that's open to those archetypes. So slotting into an existing archetype is important. The second one is something that we talk about a lot when we're looking at spoilers, which is redundancy to another powerful effect. This is a card like Betrayal, right, where Betrayal suddenly took Storm, which was a deck that was sort of middling and sort of had its, some people would play it in the Pro Tours, some people would play it at high-level competitive events, but a lot of people didn't really get it going after some of the early bans in the format that hit that deck. Betrayal took that deck and immediately made it into what was essentially a Tier 1 combo strategy for at least a year, because it was a card that was just redundant with a Goblin Electromancer. So you suddenly went from 4 copies of a powerful spell to 8 copies of a powerful spell.
I think more than redundant, I think it's sometimes better. It has 3 toughness and can sometimes loot you a card when you counter.
Yeah.
So I think that fits into your first piece where, oh, this card is similar to this and it has this added bonus for me. Hell yes, I'm going to test this.
Yep, exactly. The next one would be pushing a fringy archetype over the edge into being something new. So this is sort of attached to the point about redundancy, but this is kind of looking at decks that are on the fringe and saying, if they were to get an effect that did X, this suddenly makes this deck way more powerful because it can address a threat it couldn't address before. It has a new kind of threat in its deck that it has to deploy, things like that. And then the last one is, if something is powerful and requires a new deck, what are the tools that we need to make it work? Your faithful hosts on the Dive Down are not necessarily brewers all the time. And so I think that the brewers of the world are the people who can look at Hollow One and figure out all the pieces that can go into that to make it work, whether it's Bloodghast and using all those other pieces, realizing Faithless Looting is out there. So you could look at things like really powerful cards within the format and see if they interact with a new spoiler card in a way that's new and would require a new core or things like that. But this is the one that's the hardest, but is really important because sometimes you do have to build a new deck around a powerful card.
I think there comes a hidden fifth heuristic as well, which is non-basic lands that have activated abilities are always worth a look. Always worth even a few words. As we've seen from the deserts from Amonkhet, 5 of those, I believe, see play in very real modern decks right now, and there are other cards even from Zendikar and so forth, the lands that activate and become creatures, etc. Those are in a tier of their own, obviously, but I think any land that has an ability in addition to creating mana is worth a look, even if it's just a cursory one.
Yeah, and the most recent example of that comes to mind is Field of Ruin, right? Which is both somewhat a duplicate effect of Ghost Quarter, but at the same time has its own unique spin that makes it somewhat more playable in certain strategies.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point that lands fit in lots of decks. So using that as a filter of things that are powerful, that have powerful spell-like effects, totally makes sense. So just to wrap up, when you're thinking about cards on your own, if you want to try to keep yourself on track about like getting too hyped about things, I think people should get excited during spoiler season. That's why it's fun. But if you want to think about stuff that's actually going to slot competitively into Modern, you could kind of look at the fit, you can look at the power level, and you could look at the cost. So the way that this fits into War in the Spark in general, I just wanted to say quickly, I actually had a really hard time evaluating cards in this set.
Me too,
because
man.
of a couple of different things. I mean, what do you guys think about that?
I would say that in general, I have a hard time evaluating spoiler cards from standard sets for Modern because the threshold is so high and the results can often be pretty unexpected. And this set, because it's so unusual with all the Planeswalkers, and also because, I think Wizards is making standard into a quasi best of one format, the whole design philosophy is so different that I found there's all these factors in War of the Spark that made it really hard for me to gauge what actually is good versus what looks good.
Yeah, especially because all the Planeswalkers have like the static ability. So they're almost like this enchantment that is potentially easier to be removed because they can be hurt from direct damage and from creature damage. So you don't know how long they're going to stay, along with their minuses combining to make them even more, at risk. So that's hard to evaluate.
Yeah, that was something that I really struggled with, is looking at these uncommon Planeswalkers in particular, that some of them seem very, very good, but what actually is going to make it through as a static ability that someone can kill with a creature? Like that's pretty hard to think about,
right.
For sure.
I think we've defaulted, rightly so, in the past to 3-mana walkers are worth paying attention to and might slot into sideboards or main decks in Modern, but with the arrival of these uncommon ones, I think that really shakes up that heuristic. Just because a lot of these look very cool and very Modern playable, but it's less impactful because they don't have 3 abilities. They often have static and only a single ability.
Sure. And besides the walkers themselves, the mechanics aren't really that out there. We don't have something that's clearly designed to be abused, like the cost reducer of Spectacle, for example, like you mentioned earlier, Dave. And, there's nothing that is slotting into existing Modern deck themes too well in terms of mechanical themes. So there's nothing that's like, oh, this is going to go into Bogles because it's hexproof. I mean, that's, of course, a big reach nowadays, but something like that. You're not seeing anything that's like, oh, this is designed almost to be put into a tribal deck.
Right. I think we'll touch on this later, but I think Proliferate is a mechanic that, if was costed much more aggressively and lower, would be a shoo-in for a lot of Modern decks, but because they kept it on cards that were a little higher costed or had an activated ability to them, it's keeping it from just being plugged right into Affinity or something.
Yeah, I think Proliferate is one of the things that is hardest for me to assess, and I'm curious.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious if there are some cards in here that will go into counters-based decks that make them more powerful.
Yeah, I mean, the hard part with that is that there's already a decent card that does proliferate for a really cheap price, and that is Throne of Geth. It's a manaless activation on a 2 CMC card. Now, you do have to sacrifice an artifact to use it, but many of the decks that want to use Proliferate, at least right now in Modern, are artifact decks that potentially have tokens or want to sack things. So
Yeah, the winner of GP Yokohama actually is running some Geth in their main board. So
oh, they were? Yeah, I didn't notice that, but that it's a card that is floating around there that really, really helps. But there's nothing in the set that's close to that kind of efficiency. So
Yeah, so I agree with what you're saying, Dave. It's like, when I was seeing these spoilers being trickled out over the last 3 weeks or so, I kept saying, like, wow, the power level of the set is so high. I think there's going to be a good number of modern cards to talk about. And then when I'm looking through the spoiler set for, like, the third time, and I'm like, maybe not so much. Like, I think we've got some good cards here, but not as many as I thought I was going to have to, to select from.
agreed.
Right, and what we usually see is that even a powerful standard set, which is really impactful on that format, can maybe lead 1 to less than 5 cards into Modern so often than not. I think almost every standard set introduces at least one card that becomes Modern playable to staple, but, we rarely see cards make a big impact on Modern after appearing in a standard set.
Yeah, it's the best of the best, everybody. So just keep that in mind.
yeah, and I would definitely say that over time we see more card smolders that's become relevant as more archetypes are figured out and more decks are built. But I think initially there is a very small pool that moves over.
So in our wind down for episode 16, we had some early selections for cards that we thought had modern chops. We specifically picked Liliana's Triumph, Dovin's Veto, Teferi Time Traveler, Emergence Zone, and Dreadhorde Invasion. And this was done at a point where we had very few cards, and it was basically the first wave of spoilers, if I recall correctly, and there were just a handful that jumped out to us immediately. But because we already touched on those cards, we've decided we're not going to address those here. If you want to hear our takes on those and our early evaluations of those cards, you can check out the wind down for episode 16. But for this episode, we are going to start off with Zach's picks.
So my first pick to click is Davriel, David?
Davriel.
Davriel Rogue Shadowmage.
This is actually how my name is spelled in Welsh. I don't know if you guys know that.
Is that real?
No.
Oh, well, you got me.
Got him.
So, Davriel Rogue Shadowmage, 2 and a black, legendary planeswalker. And this is part of the uncommon cycle, where they have a static ability and only a minus ability, no plus abilities. So, Davriel Rogue Shadowmage, at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has 1 or fewer cards in hand, so 1 or 0, Davriel Rogue Shadowmage deals 2 damage to them. It has a minus, target player discards a card, and starts with 3 loyalty. So this card stuck out to me immediately because it fits into the heuristic plan of it slots into an existing deck already. And that deck is 8-Rack. So 8-Rack, if you're not familiar, is a mono-black discard-based deck. So the whole plan is using cards like Thoughtseize, Inquisition, Wrenchmind to get cards out of your opponent's hand so you can have enchantments and artifacts. You have to punish them for that. So the cards that I'm talking about are the Rack and Shrieking Affliction, where if an opponent has 3 or less cards in hand, they're taking an amount of damage based off of that. And it's different card to card, but the idea is you keep your opponent at a low amount of cards in hand, and then you are dealing damage to them based off of that.
So this is a deck that we bring up pretty often on the podcast in a sort of a little bit of a smirking way. I think it's a deck that we've all played against on LGSs and things like that.
Yeah.
Zach, why do you bring this up as something that you feel like is? Do you feel like this deck is 1 card away from being great?
I don't know if it's 1 card away from being great, but I think it's 1 to 2 cards away from being great. And it's a card that I've seen quite a bit in my LGS and even online. And I honestly think I probably have like a 70 to 80% win rate against the deck. I think that the decks I play are good, and the deck is, like I said, almost there, but it's almost there quite a bit. And I feel like a lot of games come down to, all right, I have this decision tree, and I need to make the right decision, because if I don't, I'm going to lose next turn. And I've gotten lucky, etc. But I feel like the deck is always almost just there, and through a combination of maybe pilot error, my skill, luck, whatever it is, I get there, but it's so close.
Yeah, I mean, people like Tom Ross wouldn't be bringing it to tournaments just for like a joke to goof around. I mean, they might, but Tom Ross comes to win, and he's taken it to tournaments recently, and I think he's done pretty decently with it. And I agree with you, Zach. I think this is a really good pick.
And I agree that this deck is it always feels like it's almost there. I think I can also agree that I have like a 70% win rate against 8-rack, but having been a former reformed control player, I can tell you control kind of struggles against the strategy, and it feels like there's a lot of possibilities that this could get even stronger in the right meta.
So I've played control against 8-rack a number of times against a player at the dojo who is kind of an acquaintance of ours, and I've lost every time. So I have a 0% win rate against 8-rack, so maybe it is really close.
So, Zach, the question I have to ask based on our episode, I think maybe 2 ago, where we were like, if something's going to come into 8-rack, what's going out of 8-rack?
Right. So this is a bit of a hot take, and I would like to hear you guys' reactions, responses to this, but I think you could possibly replace Liliana the Veil with this card. And I'm not saying this card's better than Liliana the Veil. That's not what I'm saying. I know Liliana the Veil is a much better card overall. I'm saying in this specific shell, I think 8-rack over the past couple sets has gotten the tools it needs to have Davriel be a more powerful Magic card in this build.
Dude, I am on board with this. I mean, I think it seems more synergistic. I mean, I know that Liliana discards, right? But
right.
I think I thought about it as something like Creeping Chill for Dredge, where because the damage Davriel's doing, it's going to just simply lower the average turn the deck kills on. And it's also a non-symmetrical effect, and it's directly on game plan, right?
Exactly. And like Stan and I had just mentioned, 8-rack feels like it is so often almost there. And I've been at games where I'm at 1 life and I'm able to all of a sudden take the game back and stabilize. And Liliana, while a good card, is not going to get that last point of damage. She will never, ever do that no matter what. There's not a way she can do that. So with Davriel, you can do that, and that is, I believe, huge in this deck. And as I mentioned, a lot of recent 8-rack lists, they're running cards like Smallpox, they're running cards like Fatal Push, they're running cards like Collective Brutality. And these cards directly remove creatures. And the only way that Liliana is really better overall is things like Hazoret or Boggles or things you can't target directly and remove. And I know there's other corner cases. I'm not trying to say that, once again, he's better than Liliana. I don't believe he is overall. But I believe that the tools that Liliana brought to 8-rack, it has aside from her, and they want a card that's going to finish the game more often.
The only thing that I see as a little bit of an issue is that Davriel is ticking down while Liliana is ticking up towards something, and that slowly is getting her into her ultimate range. It protects her from being easily hit with like direct removal or small creature damage. And so even though that's a symmetrical effect, it's honestly not always that big of a deal, and you're getting the value on your side of the board versus Davriel actually losing value.
Absolutely. I don't disagree with that at all. I think it might be wise to test some sort of mix of them.
Yeah.
Maybe 2 and 2, 3 and 1. But I think that they share a similar slot, and it'd be interesting to see how they pair up against each other or things like that.
Yeah. And also worth noting, you don't even have to tick Davriel down. His static ability is going to be relevant potentially whether or not you are using his activated ability. And likewise, I find that potentially, if you are ticking him down, the effect is relevant enough that you don't necessarily have to worry about losing him because you're still impacting your plan.
Sure. I mean, but Davriel can always hit a bolt, and Liliana, as soon as she pluses, doesn't.
Yeah, this is a big problem with this card, is that it gives your opponent's creatures a place to attack into that actually hurts your primary game plan. So I think that this is a good call still, but I would just say that, this is the type of thing you got to watch out for when you're building this new deck with Davriel in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Ensnaring Bridge is a card that 8-rack has run in the past. I know it's been falling out of favor lately. I feel like if you were to run Davriel in your deck, you would want to move up to Ensnaring Bridge in the side and maiden sub number just to have a card like that be protected a little more. Because once again, if your plan is to close out the game and you want him to do it, he needs to live to do it.
Zach, I think it's a great pick. If you hadn't picked it, I was going to, so I am on board. I think it's going to do a few cool things in Modern for sure. Stan, you're up next, yeah?
Yeah, so I've also have a Planeswalker I'm excited to talk about, and that is Gideon Blackblade. 1 white, legendary Planeswalker Gideon, static ability. As long as it's your turn, Gideon Blackblade is a 4/4 human soldier creature with indestructible that's still a Planeswalker. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to Gideon Blackblade during your turn. Gideon also has +1 up to one other target creature you control gains your choice of Vigilance, Lifelink, or Indestructible until end of turn. It's got -6, exile target non-land permanent, and he comes down with 4 loyalty counters.
Can I just say really quick, I don't usually follow the lore, but I love the lore of him having the Blackblade sword from Legends.
Yeah.
Such a great callback that they started in Dominaria, brought to here, and now this is the end of the story and ... the end of his story as well.
Yeah, I'll touch on a part of what you're referring to later. But first I want to talk about what I like about this card and why it jumped out to me. It really has a lot to do with his static ability again, because making him a creature as a static ability allows you to activate his other abilities and swing, which is something you couldn't do with previous Gideons. And I think this could be a big play if you ever get him up to 7 loyalty, where you can both remove a permanent from your opponent's board and swing. So although this does require a bit of work, and it's actually not great at protecting itself the turn it comes down, which is one of the heuristics we often use to measure the effectiveness of Planeswalkers, I think he seems really well positioned to run away with the game by being both hard to kill and setting up either 2-for-1s or 3-for-1s, depending on which deck he appears in. Coming down with 4 loyalty puts him outside of bolt range, which I think is a pretty big deal. It does get him into Boros charm range, but that's neither here nor there. Likewise, I think his abilities are actually a bit more relevant than Gideon of the Trial, and I can see him replacing Gideon of the Trial in some decks that want to run either one or the other. That said, this Gideon really makes me like Trials more in the same deck as Blackblade, and I think Trials emblem becomes more relevant when you have Blackblade on the battlefield. Plus, Trials can help protect you from a board of pesky creatures and could potentially help you protect your Planeswalkers in a way that Blackblade does not. So the main reason why I think Blackblade is likely better by himself than Trials is because most decks that would run Trials probably don't have to worry about pesky creatures to begin with, as nowadays he's most often a clock for control decks. Additionally, I think he can actually make Trials a bit better because he makes the you can't lose the game emblem seem to me way more relevant than I have previously found. So in my experience running Gideon of the Trials in blue-white control, which I think tends to be the home he's most often in, when you're making that emblem, there's no guarantee that you'll either have him around for very long or that you even need to worry about losing the game because of whether or not you have a Planeswalker on the board, if that makes sense to you guys.
Yeah, definitely makes sense.
Yeah, I can also see Blackblade coming down on turn 3 if the board is empty and totally running away with the game by himself, especially if your opponents have no creatures around and if you have 1 or 2. If we're talking about control, maybe you have a Snapcaster, maybe you have a Creeping Tar Pit, maybe you have a Celestial Colonnade, maybe you even have a Soldier token from
Timely Reinforcements.
Yeah. So if I was testing with him on day 1, I think the first place I would really try him in is in either blue-white or Esper Control. But I also kind of want to see whether people revisit the Gideon tribal strategies, as the 2-drops plus Gideon Ally of Zendikar can potentially be a strong enough strategy now when you're coupling them with really good removal or other control tools.
Yeah, I think Gideon Tribal is a deck that is underappreciated and has always been on the fringes of things. Not similar to 8-Rec, I think it's much more fringe than that, but it's a real deck. And I think that having a blue-white control package with this Gideon Tribal in it is a very powerful deck, and we just might see it pushed over with this.
Yeah, so to summarize, 3 mana, he comes down outside of bolt range. His static ability is one that you used to have to activate, so you can potentially activate one of his abilities and swing with him in the same turn. And last but not least, this is the best art I have ever seen on a Gideon.
Yeah, that's Rakdos's wings behind him, by the way, which is some sick lore.
So, Gideon, R.I.P., you fought well, and I at least really appreciate that you ended on a high point. I wonder if you guys think he's as good as I do.
Yeah, I'm going to ask all our followers to press F right now to pay respects to this fallen soldier.
As long as F upvotes our podcast.
You're going to have to remap your keyboard to make sure you get that effect.
So I'm gonna hop in real quick and just say I think this Gideon is good. I think it's a mix with other Gideons because it has a really powerful minus ability that takes a little bit of time to get up to. But boy, that's nice utility to have, the exile a target permanent, and the fact that you can bring it in plus it. And then it's out, it's 5 loyalty. Hopefully you can kind of hang on to it for a minute and then, attack a couple of times and then exile a permanent seems pretty good to me.
You can view my silence as incredible doubt.
Say what?
So Shane, you are disinterested in a white card, a planeswalker, a card that probably fits into a control or sort of blue-white kind of shell. You're not interested in that? I'm shocked.
I honestly just don't see how it fits in control. Like, I think Gideon of the Trials is a better blue-white control Gideon Planeswalker myself. But, what do I know?
So are you saying that because his plus ability doesn't target him and he would really need another creature on the board to shine?
Yeah, exactly. What's that plus doing?
Yeah, maybe it belongs more in the Oops All Gideons deck instead, or in
I'd love to see that. That sounds way cooler to me than trying to shove it into a control strategy myself. But like I said, I don't play those very much ever. So yeah, I think it's remains to be seen. It's a 3-mana walker. It does some cool stuff. It's a big body, good amount of loyalty, has a cool big minus. Why not?
For what it's worth, I do think Oops All Gideons is considered a control strategy. I think that's what I picked up on from listening to Masters of Modern, but maybe that's debatable.
So thanks for that, Stan. I love those Gideons.
You're welcome.
All right, so I'm going to go next, and
Dave, I can't believe what I'm looking at here.
I know somehow I am going to talk about a green card. Who would have ever thought that was possible?
You should not even have a green section in your binder.
I know. I used to.
Is that true?
Yeah, my Modern collection used to just be Woober.
That's my son's name, so please a little respect.
Woober. Yeah, I literally had all my binders for Modern. There was 20 pages for white, 20 pages for blue, 10 pages for red, 10 pages for black, and a single page for green that just had Birds of Paradise on it, and that was it. Waiting for the future. So I've changed a little bit. I got my Noble Hierarchs, a couple of months ago, so now I'm willing to play green decks. And so the card that I've chosen for this is Finale of Devastation. So it's the first one of the cycle that is X green, and the text says, search your library and or graveyard for a creature card with converted mana cost X or less and put it onto the battlefield. If you search your library this way, shuffle it. If X is 10 or more, creatures you control get +X and gain haste until the end of turn. It's a sorcery. Does this card sound familiar to anybody?
It seems like Green Sun Zenith with a bunch of extra text on it.
It's Green Sun Zenith with an extra green mana in the cost line and a bunch of extra text on it. Exactly. And actually some other extra text as well. And as we all know, Green Sun Zenith is banned in Modern. So I think that what's interesting about this card is that we should stop for a minute and talk about why supposedly Green Sun Zenith is banned. There's really only one source to look at for that, and that's the banned and restricted announcement from 2011 where it was banned. And what it said in there was basically they felt like the card was so powerful and efficient that it would reduce the diversity of green decks in Modern, because the answer to every strategy that green had at that point in time was to use Green Sun Zenith. So if you wanted to be a ramp deck, you should use Green Sun Zenith. If you wanted to be a toolkit deck, you should use Green Sun Zenith. If you wanted to get some kind of combo-y card like Primeval Titan, you should use Green Sun Zenith. So they felt like at the time that the deck was just too pervasive in order to do that. So let's talk about what's different from this card from Green Sun Zenith. Like we already said, costs 1 more green. So that's a big knock, right? Because what we were talking about earlier in the card evaluation section was that cards that have 1 converted mana cost have a big kind of plus next to them. This one starts out at 2 instead, and so I think that it makes it a little bit less utility than Green Sun Zenith right off the bat. Green Sun Zenith shuffles back into your library after you use it, because all the weird Zenith cards do that. I don't know why they thought at the time that a repeatable tutor wouldn't be a problem, but I think that's a pretty big difference between this one and the other one. Now, fortunately, this one doesn't exile itself after you use it, so there's potentially other things that you do with it, but it's worth noting.
For what it's worth, I believe the Zenith cards were a reference to the Pulse Cycle from Darkseal, where if a condition was met, the spell returned to your hand upon resolution.
That's right. That makes a ton of sense. Still, really powerful effect that's not on
Oh,
this
yeah,
one.
no, those are very broken cards, yeah.
The thing that's a big plus on the side of Finale of Devastation is that it doesn't only get green creatures. So Green Sun Zenith only got green cards. This is any card. And the other thing is it's any card in your library or your graveyard, which was also not the same on Green Sun Zenith. Green Sun Zenith only got cards from your library.
Yeah.
So those are the things that are different about it. I think to give it a little bit of a sense of where this might see play, we should take a look at where it's seeing play in Legacy, because it is kind of a Legacy staple right now. It's in a lot of different decks. Maybe they're kind of fringy decks. It's not in your Delver decks. It's not in your, your sneak and show decks or any of that kind of stuff. But it is used in Elves to tutor for ramp and for tutoring up elves that you need. It's used in Maverick for tutoring up toolbox cards. There are some combo decks that use it to tutor up pieces. So it's used in the way in Legacy the same way that it was talked about being used in the Bandit Restricted announcement all the way back in 2011 when it was banned out of Modern. So I think that we can assume that's going to be used in the same way here. The extra mana makes me think, though, that it's likely to be used less in ramp situations than in combo or kind of mana, like big, powerful end game kind of situations, or as a powerful mana sink for a deck that can generate a ton of mana. Specifically, one of the reasons I don't think it's going to be used as a ramp that much is because, one of the reasons that it stayed banned in Modern supposedly is that it can tutor up an Arbor Dryad for a single green mana, which is a way for a deck to go to another consistent way for a deck to kind of ramp up really quickly in combination with something like Llanowar Elves or Noble Hierarch or something like that, to give you a lot of options to, if you need more mana fast, or if you need to get a toolboxy card. It's just kind of a lot of utility on a single card. I think that Finale of Devastation costing an extra green is going to make it used a lot less likely in that situation to get Arbor Dryad. So what do you think about this card so far, guys?
I mean, I think it seems good. I've played some of the Vizier combo decks before where they're using Court of Calling and Collected Company to get their pieces out. I'm curious. My question that pops into my mind is, why am I playing this over Court of Calling? Do you have any thoughts on that, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reason is that it can get... so it does cost 1 mana less all in, although
Sure.
it doesn't convoke, so that makes it harder. Court of Calling is an instant, of course,
Yeah.
so that makes it a little bit better as well. I think that the last thing is that this can get a card from your graveyard too, if you want. So if
Sure.
you're in a deck that's only running single pieces, like a toolboxy kind of strategy, you can use this instead of pulling a card from your library.
Mm-hmm.
I also think that it's possible that the 1 mana just makes a difference for decks that kind of have more mana over time that maybe don't have creatures in them. So if you're thinking about something that's not going to flood the board with a bunch of stuff to convoke with, this could still be an okay card to use instead.
Yeah, I almost wish that it somehow gave you a benefit if it was already in your graveyard, and it's probably too powerful because there's lots of ways to cheat stuff into your graveyard in Modern especially.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, so there's 3 decks that I think it could kind of go into in Modern. I think it could go in Elves. I think it could potentially be tested in Primeval Titan decks, and I think it could go in creature-based combo decks. So, Stan, what do you think? You've played Elves. What do you think about this card going into Elves?
Yeah, I mean, I've even played a little bit of Amulet Titan. The Elves one, it's trickier. My initial reaction was probably not, but after thinking about it some more, I can start to see some of its utility, in part because Elves can have this problem where you can produce a ton of mana and don't have anything to spend it on.
Yeah, so I think that Elves is interesting just because it's the only deck that even has a shot, I think, at getting to the 10 mana. So
I think Mono Green Devotion is a dark horse contender for a deck that can use this card.
Ooh.
I think it's another deck that's been on the fringes of things and is very powerful and can make quite a bit of mana and would love to tutor up something.
I think that's a really good point that I had not considered as another deck that just generates a ton of mana that has a lot of creatures in it. So I think that a lot of people are also looking at this card in Primeval Titan decks. I don't think it's going to get there for that deck, just really quickly, because I think that it's too expensive, and Summoner's Pact is just better. Amulet is just better, plus land. So I don't think ultimately it's going to go that way. I think, there might have been a time where even Green Sun Zenith was good enough to be in that deck, but I don't think that time is now. And then the last thing is, I think that it has a chance to go into Vannifar, Vizier combo, or Kiki-Jiki kind of decks. And maybe it's more in a Vannifar deck than it is in Vizier combo decks, because one thing about the Vannifar deck is that it plays a bunch of mana dorks, where some of the other decks don't play that as much. Like, it plays 4 Noble Hierarchs and 4 Birds of Paradise that you can tap for mana, or you could tap to convoke anyway. So I kind of think that getting a combo piece back from either your deck or one from the graveyard or a toolbox from that case seems like it could be really good as well. So I ultimately, I don't think this card is a 4 of, but I think it's a powerful card that people are excited to see, kind of a take on a card that's on the banned list that I think people are definitely going to test.
Yeah, it's definitely very cool. It's up my alley. If it gives more pieces to the Vizier combo decks, I'm hyped about it. I've been wanting to get back into those, so give me another reason to, please.
So Shane, you're next. What's your card?
So guys, I do feel bound by law to talk about the new Karn, and he has this really cool title. It makes him sound like some kind of tiny god. It is Karn, the Great Creator. He's a 4 colorless mana planeswalker, of course. His static text reads, activated abilities of artifacts your opponents control can't be activated. His +1 until your next turn. Up to 1 target non-creature artifact becomes an artifact creature with power and toughness, each equal to its converted mana cost. His -2, you may choose an artifact card you own from outside the game or in exile, reveal that card and put it into your hand, and he comes down with 5 loyalty. So, pretty rad, right? So let's start with the static. It's a non-symmetrical Stony Silence. Pretty handy versus maybe the Tron Mirror. It can help with decks like War Prison, where they can't use their Mox Opals or Welding Jars. It can shut off the Sword of the Meek and Thopter combo if Prison's running that version as well. What do you guys think about this static?
4 seems like a lot to pay for it.
Yes, I agree. I agree with that. I think it's kind of like, it's not, I don't think you're casting it for the static, but I think it's handy.
Yeah, it just feels like extra on top of what is already a very good card. I like it, I'll take it, but I am not running this card for that ability.
Yeah. So the plus, it's pretty funny because no one's really talking about the plus because the minus is so novel and cool. But it's pretty incidental value, but I think the plus could really be doing something. Like after you're casting the hate piece that you wished for, if you didn't have an artifact down already, you're beating down with it as well. So it's a creature until your next turn. And so Zach was like, hey, you can block with your Relic of Progenitus, then you can pop it. It's double duty for you. So the -2, this is what everyone's really excited about, right? Because it allows you to have a wish board, which is not a super common thing to have in Modern. It says you can get an artifact card you own from outside the game or in exile. So in the text in terms of Modern means a sideboard card you have.
Yeah, some people call this a wish board, which is a reference to a cycle of cards that was printed in Judgment, where each of them in the 5 colors could tutor a card of your choice from outside the game with conditions. So people would create a sideboard full of cards they would want and therefore call it their wish board because they were getting these cards out of their sideboard with the wish cycle.
The ostensible use here, right, is getting some kind of artifact hate card to shut down your opponent's game plan. And so the most popular one people have been mentioning is Mycosynth Lattice. It's a 6 CMC artifact that makes every permanent in play an artifact, including your opponent's lands, which then in combination with a static ability means that your opponent just can't tap their lands for mana any longer. So if you untap and cast Lattice, your opponent's going to be effectively locked out of the game. And so I'm definitely looking forward to beating down with like my 6/6 Mycosynth Lattice that I also shut my opponent out of the game with if they don't just scoop immediately. But There's all sorts of other artifacts one can run in a wishboard scenario. Like you can have Ensnaring Bridge for creature strategies. You can have your Tormod Crypt, your Grafdigger's Cage, your Relic of Progenitus for Graveyard Hate, a Pithing Needle, a Sorceress Spyglass, a Damping Matrix, a Phyrexian Revoker to kind of shut down unique activated abilities. You can get like Trinosphere or Defense Grid to tax spells. You can get a Chalice, things like that.
Yeah, a card I'm very excited to grab with this is Torpor Orb. No joke. I find that there are a lot of creatures with very good ETB or end of the battlefield effects these days, and Torpor Orb has pulled a lot of weight in games 2 and 3, so being able to pull it when you need it game 1 seems incredibly powerful.
If you have like Tron Maid, you can cast your Karn for 4. You can wish for a 3 CMC card like an Ensnaring Bridge, an O-Stone, a Trinosphere, a Grafdigger's Cage, Damping Matrix. You can cast it that turn. So it clearly has some capability in various Tron strategies. It could be Green Tron. I think it could have a place in Blue Tron, which already operates something like an artifact toolbox deck at times. I've seen a lot of Blue Tron players be hyped about this on the Tron subreddit. So how is it going to be used? I'm not exactly sure. It could be start as like maybe a fun of and some testing. I'm not exactly sure what it replaces. There's a few borderline cards in the main that kind of fluctuate in Greentron. You can move an O-Stone to the side that can be wished for, and so I can see the deck staying at 3 of those. It's kind of been popular to run 3. Maybe shave one of the other marginal cards in the main. That can have a more targeted effect in your sideboard. But the real issue I have is, can the sideboard be modified in the way that's necessary to allow you to fit all those options in without diluting it? And like we talked about a few episodes ago, just how streamlined and targeted the Tron sideboard is, I don't know how you make that room for a number of wishboard cards. So I think it's going to remain to be seen how this works out.
Yeah, exactly. I'm more excited for a card like this in Mono Red Prison, which is a deck that has a sideboard that is anywhere from 8 to 11 artifact cards.
Yeah.
So I feel like this is a card that really is going to benefit from an existing build rather than building around it. It is incredibly powerful, and being able to tutor a one-sided lock is not something that really exists in Modern currently. But I don't think you want to build around this. I think this wants to fit into an existing build that's going to abuse it.
Yeah. But your boy did get Japanese Mycosynth Lattice today because this card does not exist in Russian. So I had to pick one up, and I am waiting to get my Russian Karnsky from my connection over there. So I will be testing it.
Voldemir's bringing it.
Please, his name is Dmitry, and I'm not lying.
Perfect.
Yeah, so that's our first run through. I think we all have a secondary pick to go through as well. We'll just hit those hard and fast. I think these are some cool picks, so I do want to talk about them.
So, as alluded to in the opening, I have Sarkhan the Masterless as my second pick. So, Sarkhan the Masterless, 3 and 2 red, legendary planeswalker, Sarkhan. Static ability, whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, each dragon you control deals 1 damage to that creature. 2 active. Yeah, thank you for the laughter.
Dragon control.
So, starts with 5 loyalty and 2 abilities that interact with loyalty counters. So, +1 loyalty. Until end of turn, each planeswalker you control becomes a 4/4 red dragon creature and gains flying.
To the skies, my friends.
-3, create a 4/4 red dragon creature token with flying. So, why this card? Aside from the obvious, this is a card that is...
Because it's Sarkhan and it's red.
Yeah, because it's Sarkhan. I like him, as we know. It is a large red drop in Modern, which I also like. Reminds me of things like Stormbreath, Thundermaw, and Glorybringer, in that it's a 5-drop dragon synergistic card. But as I'd mentioned last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago at this point, Sarkhan Fireblood is a card that is near and dear to my heart and is so close to being there, but is not quite. And something I talked about that would really push him over is Dragon Tribal. And this is Dragon Tribal. I don't know if it's a Dragon Tribal we need, but it's a Dragon Tribal we're currently getting.
You go to war with the dragons you have, not the dragons you want.
Yeah, exactly. So when I saw this card, I looked at it and went, I'm not quite sure. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that even if this isn't exactly Modern playable, I like what it's doing for Modern, and that it's opening up more dragon design space. So I talked about how Sarkhan was plussing to cast dragons, but none of them were really what we wanted. And this isn't, you can't plus Sarkhan to play this card, but it's rewarding you for playing dragons. So I feel like right now they're paving the way to play more dragons, and we're going to get a dragon payoff soon, or that's what I hope. So I don't know if this card's playable. I don't know if I'm going to test it most certainly in my Scred Dragons build. But I think it's close, but I think it's a harbinger of things to come and a harbinger of the design mentality, where they're rewarding more maybe off-brand or not quite modern playable tribes.
Cool. We can go on to the next one, I think.
Yeah, so my next pick is a 1 mana spell, which is one of our favorite topics for identifying modern playable cards, and that is Price of Betrayal. Costs a single black, sorcery, remove up to 5 counters from target artifact, creature, planeswalker, or opponent. So my primary issue with this card is that it's a sorcery speed, and yet I still think it's good enough to be a very useful sideboard tool in black-based decks. And to me, I think first and foremost, this card is probably just going to be used as a planeswalker removal spell. We don't have 1 mana planeswalker removal spells that I'm aware of off the top of my head. So I think it really fits a unique slot in that regard. And with the exception of like maybe Tron, if you're playing against blue-white, or even if you're playing against Liliana's or Sarkhan Fireblood, removing 5 counters is usually enough to deal with a planeswalker. So
yeah, I was just running through my mind, like how many times do I see them consistently go above 5, and it feels like it would cover a lot of those cases.
In addition to it being potentially a really useful removal spell, it having these other modes, I think, makes it flexible enough that it could come in handy in unexpected situations. Some that come to mind off the top of my head is maybe dealing with a hangerback walker, because once you remove those counters from a hangerback walker, when it dies, it no longer makes Thopters. Perhaps other targets in Hardened Scales Affinity, because they're moving counters all over the place. So if you're dealing with a board where you only have an artifact with a single artifact with a bunch of counters on it, and you're able to remove that could work, possibly. Even maybe against Tron, if they have an O-Stone and you're trying to punish their own fate counters, I think that's really corner case, and I'm kind of really digging in deep to see where it's playable. But one of the things that I found particularly interesting about this card is the last one, where it removes counters from an opponent. And right now, I think the main counter your opponents might have are poison counters. And I can't help but wonder if this is a signal for something that's to come.
Well, one other counter type that people have is energy.
Yes.
Which, if there was ever some energy deck that happened in Modern, maybe this is some kind of thing in there too.
Yeah.
Like a safety valve.
Yeah, so I think the things you do not want to target with this are Thing in the Ice.
Can I ask about this really quickly, though?
Yeah.
Can you target your own Thing in the Ice?
You certainly can.
So I don't think that's a thing.
Blue-black Thing in the Ice?
Yeah, blue-black Thing in the Ice where I can flip it for 1 mana. I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's a thing. Turn 3. I mean, I guess, on Phoenix, you can sometimes flip Thing in the Ice on turn 3 anyway, but here's a single card that does it.
This card would have to draw a card, right, to be good enough for that deck?
For sure. I mean, it's really cornery, but it makes me wonder if there's other cards out there that are beneficial for you to remove counters from yourself.
Do I make you cornery, baby?
That's one. I guess you don't want to target your opponent's Walking Ballista either, unless you really want them to pop it before they, just zap you with it in response.
I mean, that's a play that happens with Walking Ballista no matter what removal you target it with. So, it works.
It's worth noting this also hits Chalice of the Void charge counters. I know we talked about how 1 is the best number to put Chalice on, which shuts this off. But if opponent has a Chalice on 2 that's keeping you from doing your thing, you can take them down to 1 or 0 if you want to.
Oh, that's interesting.
It also does that for engineered explosives, which most of the time they're probably just going to crack it in response. But it might be worth bringing in if there's no other ways to get rid of it or just to hedge your bets. Once again, very fringe, but worth noting because it might win you a game sometime.
Yeah, I mean, engineered explosives controller still needs to have mana up to crack it.
Exactly.
So you could, again, time it well enough that you punish them for the mana they've already spent.
Great. Well, I think that's a cool card. It's definitely one that I stopped and looked at for a long time when I was reading the spoiler to see if there was a way to use it.
Oh yeah, it has applicability for sure. Application.
Yeah, it's one of those that I think is going to appear as a 1 or 2 of in some sideboards as just a nice flexible utility slot, and then could potentially get broken into some other strategy that we don't even anticipate at this point.
And hey, I think the card that I'm spoiling actually is a similar kind of thing in some ways, where it could be a weird sideboard card or it could be something that people try to break. And that card is Finale of Promise. So I went with the big statements on this time. Both of my spoilers are finales of blank. So Finale of Promise is the red one. Its casting cost is X, red, red. It's a sorcery, and it has a lot of text on it, just like the green one does. It says, you may cast up to 1 target instant and or up to 1 target sorcery card from your graveyard, each with converted mana cost X or less without paying their mana costs. If a card cast this way would be put into your graveyard this turn, exile it instead. If X is 10 or more, copy each of those spells twice. You may choose new targets for the copies. Boy, these finale cards are really complicated. But I think the thing that's really interesting about this card is that in the right deck, it could be a really solid 2-for-1. The main place that I saw some writing about this was from our mathematician crush, Frank Karsten, who just published an article on Channel Fireball. And I think you should go read it if you want to see what types of decks you could use this card in, because it actually is a lot more plausible than I think I thought it was when I first read it, to have a deck that has enough instants and sorceries in the graveyard to make it worth casting. So the main thing that I think is interesting about this as well is that it's a single card that can trigger Arclight Phoenix is coming back later in the game once you have some cards in your graveyard. Because if you draw this, it's 1 cast, but you actually cast the cards, so they count as triggers for things like Arclight Phoenix or things that count spells being cast, as opposed to cards that are like put it into play or things like that. And so the place that Professor Karsten thought it would end up was in Mono Red Phoenix in some quantity, which I think is an interesting take as a way to give that deck a little extra push towards the end of towards the end of a game.
Something I've always wondered, and it comes into play with this card, is how much thought is put into the phrasing with cast, put into play, enters, etc. Because this very much, you're right, it synergizes excellently. And do you think that's intentional? Do you think that was just sort of the way it worked out in R&D?
I mean, I think that, you mean as far as synergizing directly with Arclight Phoenix goes?
Yeah, or synergizing directly with cards that reward casting.
I think they probably thought about that a lot, because they do a lot of mechanics that put cards into play or let you copy them, and all those things don't count as casting. But in this case, they decided they had to do it that way, and it's a mythic rare, so I think they thought about that particular aspect of it a lot.
Sure.
But I think Stan is somebody who's played a lot of Mono Red Phoenix. I don't think I wonder if this is a card that you think would be interesting in there in a limited quantity to give a little bit of a stretch to the end game.
What would it replace?
The best question.
World's Weary Traveler is not interested in the question.
What would it replace? I think it's a good question. I guess in my mind, I could see it replacing some quantity of Light Up the Stage as kind of like a different card advantage engine.
So that's actually a question I had. Do alternate casting costs work from the graveyard, for example? Like, so let's say I've enabled Spectacle and I cast this for X equals 1. Can I cast my Spectacle to light up the stage from the graveyard, or no?
No, it's
CMC
always
3.
Always the upper right.
Yep, just like we said. Okay, just wanted to double check.
Always the upper right. So no, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, just because the way this one is worded. If it said you could cast a spell from your graveyard, you then could cast it for its spectacle cost because the conditions have been met. But because this one says with converted mana cost X or less.
Okay.
All right, Dave, to answer your question after I've given it a little bit more thought, and granted I haven't read the Karsten article, I think it would require a ton of mana for this to be useful in the Phoenix deck, and that deck is running 18 lands. It's sometimes getting through an entire game with like 2 to 3 lands on the board, and it doesn't have a ton of options to get through the deck to begin with. So if that's the home for it that people are speculating, I'm initially skeptical.
I have watched you win games with 2 lands in play.
Yeah.
And a deck that is going to do that is not casting this card.
So here's what I think. I think you can cast this for 3. And so remember, I've played that deck some too. And I think that the idea that maybe it comes out of the sideboard in a match where you think you might need some card advantage or a way to access additional cards out of the graveyard is a potential play for this card. Because keep in mind, you can target Faithless Looting with it and Lava Spike for the sorceries, and then you can target Bolt, you can target Gut Shot, you can target a whole bunch of one mana cost cards that can help you use it too. So I kind of feel like there might be a little play for it as a role player there.
I really just feel like, I mean, you talked about replacing Light Up the Stage with it, but Light Up the Stage kind of filters you through your lands and gets you to hit those lands that are sometimes more challenging to hit as well, and this doesn't do that.
Yeah,
So
I think it's some quantity of Light Up the Stage. I don't think this is a 4 of. I think this is like a 1 or 2, maybe out of the sideboard, in a deck that has the right mix of instants and sorceries. Another deck that honestly has the right mix of instants and sorceries in it is also Burn. And so there's a chance that you could think of it a similar way, in that way where if you want a card that you might get late game where you want some gas or recast something, this gives you some card advantage.
Yeah, I like it way more in As Foretold decks, to be honest.
So here's the tricky thing about this and As Foretold decks. So that's the other application where people are talking about this. But the thing with that is the card has to be in your graveyard in order to cast it for the zero casting cost. So you would have to switch As Foretold decks around to be playing
Faithless Looting.
Hello.
Looting, right? Yeah, that seems fine. Why don't they? Yeah, I mean,
so I think it's
stuff in the graveyard.
I think it's
right?
fine. It's just it's a card that they don't play right now, and so in order to use this card, I don't know if it's to have Electro Dominance as number 5 and 6, if it's worth it to also bring Faithless Looting in as part of the package. I mean, honestly, I think there's a chance that this could replace As Foretold in decks like that if you wanted to go all in on it for Electro Dominance, for Finale of Promise, for Faithless Looting, and then build the rest of the deck around that core. I think that also could work.
Mono Red Living End?
Yeah, I definitely think it's possible. So, I mean, As Foretold is a good card, but it's pretty slow in compared with some of these other things. So I think that's a possible use for it as well.
Shane, I think you're going to take us out.
All right. Last up is another pretty hyped card called Blast Zone, which is a land, and it enters the battlefield with a charge counter on it. You can tap it to add colorless mana. It has an activated ability of XX tap. Put X charge counters on Blast Zone, so you cannot tap it for mana and tap it for its ability in the same turn. And then you can pay 3 and tap it to sacrifice Blast Zone to destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost equal to the number of charge counters on Blast Zone. So, kind of like a Ratchet Bomby type card, which is a 2-mana artifact where you can tap it to put a charge counter on it, then you can tap it and sacrifice it, and it destroys everything with CMC equal to the number of charge counters on Ratchet Bomb.
I just want to point out that this is a land card with 8 lines of rule checks on it.
Yeah.
It's quite a few.
You don't see cards like this too much, do you?
No, you sure don't.
It looks like something out of, like, Onslaught.
Or like a commander set or something like that.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Yeah, so
I also want to point out that it doesn't come into play tapped.
This is a huge
so you can
thing.
Play
I was
this
just going to
and
say.
Activate it. Like I honestly, up until right now, I had assumed this came into play tapped because I knew what it did and seemed so powerful. But when Shane just read it out loud, I realized, holy crap, this card you can play and activate.
Yeah, but the bigger thing, honestly, here is that you can play it and tap it for mana. Because most of the time, these cards that have this much utility, think creature lands, they always come into play tapped because they're so good. I mean, number one, they turn them as dual lands a lot of times these days, but cards that have this much utility that are lands often make you take a step off of your curve, and this one doesn't make you do that.
Yeah, especially in where I think it's going to fit in mostly, which is like colorless or monocolor decks. So this provides some utility that's normally reserved for multicolored decks that would run engineered explosives otherwise and kind of have had to rely on the somewhat slower and counterable, unlike a land spell like Ratchet Bomb. And so, like we talked about earlier, lands with spell-like abilities are pretty powerful. Like, they can't be countered, they can be used for mana in the meantime, and then when needed, they can be used for their ability. They can't be abraded, they can't be nature's claimed.
And they also don't take up the slot that would be used by a spell.
Yeah. So, but they can be Ghost Quartered, they can be Fulminator Maged, they can be Blood Mooned. So there's some pros and cons there, but the pros are pretty good. So I've seen people talk about this in like colorless Eldrazi, nearly running at nearly no cost versus having to sideboard in their Ratchet Bomb. So they're talking about shaving things like, maybe a Singleton Wastes, a Radiant Fountain, maybe some other utility lands like a Scavenger Grounds or a Cavern of Souls or a Gemstone Cavern, to make room for 4 of these instead. And so these colorless Eldrazi players seem super hyped for this. People are talking about it in Amulet Titan. It's a tutorable land. It's easier to tutor up lands in that than it is to transmute for 1, or tutor up like engineered explosives rather. And so that can blow things up, like an Ensnaring Bridge or a Damping Sphere that's hurting the Amulet Titan player. It solves some problems for Bluetron. The lack of sweepers and removal in blue in general are an issue, so this can act as a land and then can easily be pumped with the huge amounts of Tron mana you're making and then be blown up to, kill a bunch of stuff that you want to get rid of. What do you think about that in Bluetron?
So I think that Bluetron's definitely going to be running a number of these cards. I don't know how many. I'm not as familiar with the deck as I am with Burn or Scred or, Prison, things like that. But this answers a lot of issues. This deck can quickly put a ton of counters on it to answer any threats it needs to. It's not easy to remove this threat, etc. And you're able to protect it with all your counter spells, so on and so forth. Once again, I don't know the exact number, but this is a card that instantly just slots into a big mana deck like that. Eldrazi Tron or Bluetron come to mind.
Sure. I'm not sure the sees play in Green Tron. I mean, I've actually gone up to 5 forests and only down to 2 utility lands in Ghost Quarter and Sanctum. Not even the Horizon Canopy, because there's so many times I need to get 4 to 5 basic forests a game because of things like Path or Ghost Quarter or Assassin's Trophy that I'm wanting those 5 lately. And this does have some downsides. I can't hit tokens. And it seems a little bit slow potentially, but definitely has, I think, a role to play in the modern format.
So, also of note, cannot hit Chalice of the Void, because when it's in the battlefield, its CMC is 0. So this card can't ever deal with the Chalice.
It's a great point.
So when I think of Chalice, though, charge counters, this card also does charge counters. Talking about Chalice decks, Dave, do you think Thalia Stompy wants this?
I mean, I think that it's the type of deck that would definitely play this card and would play it to almost no detriment at all. Like, it just seems like free value. So I would give it a try for sure. Yeah, I'm pretty excited about this card. It just seems like it has a lot of potential to do lots of different things. And so interesting that you mentioned that it could go in a deck that I've been playing a lot lately. I didn't even think about it, but I would.
Yeah. I think Shane's rules of it being either colorless or monocolored are very true, and Thalia Stompy is a mono-white deck that makes use of, interesting lands like we've talked about with Eldrazi Temple and other things like that.
Yeah. I think one thing that's super crazy about this card is that since it comes into play with a single counter on it, think of all the decks that have single counter permanent or single CMC permanents in Modern. Like, this is one of the cardinal rules that we have for thinking about evaluating cards in Modern. I mean, look at Burn. Like, if you were facing down a board with a bunch of creatures and you managed to get to 4, that could happen. Look at Grixis Death Shadow. What does Death Shadow do with this card? Like, if
they run Molten Rain.
I get of course they do. But if someone plays one of these against you and they've managed Grixis Death Shadow doesn't usually kill you on turn 4, right? Like, it's kind of playing a more mid-rangey game. You can't Thoughtseize this card. They have no main board outs to it. It seems pretty rough against a deck that's playing a bunch of one CMC cards.
Yeah, I would say most decks aren't even running full mirror mages in the sideboard. I would say the vast majority of Grixis decks don't have an answer to this. And maybe if it gets played, they'll start sideboarding and they have options for sure.
Right.
But I think right now, you bring this out and they just go, I have to win with the Delve threat. Like, my shadows are gone. That's how it's going to be. I have to land Tassiger to win now.
Or Fishman.
Me, I'm a Fishman.
So there you have it, folks. Our picks for War of the Spark. Buy these cards 8 at a time. Sell them more for later because they're sure to spike after this episode drops.
I'm sorry to say I don't have any picks for speculation this time. I didn't even look at any of the pre-sale prices for these cards.
Mm-mm.
And for what it's worth, Stan, 9 is a brewer's dozen.
We're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we're going to go through a quick tournament report from a Modern 2K I played in over the weekend. Stay with us. Guys, I played at Modern 2K over the weekend at Pastimes in Niles.
And you won all 2K?
Not quite.
Yeah, all first place,
First
right, baby?
place got $600. So I guess 2K just means that's the total prize purse.
Yeah, that's what that means.
Not what first place gets.
It's in the fine print. But the cool thing for me is I cashed for the first time ever in a competitive REL tournament.
Yeah, buddy. You got actual
Did it
cash.
feel good,
I saw
Stan?
that photo. You had actual cash in hand, not even store credit.
2 20s and a 10. Count it up, $50.
What was the entry
It
fee?
looked powerful, and I hope it felt powerful.
And you know what? I'm so excited for when that money is going to come over here to help fix the door you broke in my house.
Pay what you owe,
You already
Stan.
fixed
Pay
that
what
door.
you owe.
I actually did fix it this weekend, so we're good.
Did you get a new patio door?
No, I fixed it.
Oh, okay. I thought you were getting new doors.
We were, but then I fixed it.
Okay.
So this was a 6-round Modern tournament. I'm not going to go into very minute detail. I want to do a very quick roundup of my matches with just like a single tweet length takeaway of what I learned or my feelings were. And then I have a couple like questions for you guys, in fact, to see how you would weigh in on what I'm thinking about. The mind palace that I've been in this week.
A Fortress of Solitude, if you would, please.
Absolutely. So
What's on your mind, Grape, Stan?
first round matchup, humans. I don't know about you guys, but I love winning round 1 of a comp REL event. I think it's important.
It's never happened to me, so I don't know.
What a unique feeling.
I don't know. I feel like it's such a great way to start the day. Like if you can get a round 1 win, especially against a real competitive deck like Modern Humans is, it puts pep in my step. Not to mention the opponent match win percentage can be relevant if your breakers are something that could determine how you finish at the end of the tournament. So getting that round 1 win, pretty key. Nailed it. Also, I got crazy lucky, guys, because my opponent made a pretty major misplay that would have cost me a game that I otherwise won. Or
Did
in
they
fact
just
won.
scoop? They just scooped up all their cards for no reason.
No, they just forgot the casting cost of Reflector Mage.
Ooh.
That was in their hand. In any case, I then played Etron. So I should also mention I'm on Is It Phoenix, and Etron is a tough matchup.
We just assume that you're on Is It Phoenix whenever you're talking. Yeah.
Yeah, you should. Unless otherwise noted, I'm on a Phoenix deck. In this case, I was Is It Phoenix. Etron, main deck Chalice of the Void, really hard for me. They took game 1. Also, this matchup had my misplay of the day. Really, I think the only truly egregious error I made, wherein my opponent played Cavern of Souls, named Eldrazi, cast Reality Smasher. I'm like, oh snap, Reality Smasher. Snapcaster, target a Ceremonious Rejection in my graveyard. Cast Ceremonious Rejection, and my opponent goes, okay, Reality Smasher resolves. Since they used their Cavern of Souls to cast it.
Ooh.
And I was like, oopsie.
Man.
I still won though,
Yeah.
thanks to my foil Set Adrift.
Uh,
I just played a good tempo game, and Set Adrift got me there.
I would like you to thank me by name right now, if that's possible, because I made that
Zach
happen.
Culhan, thank you so much for telling me to get Set Adrift in foil.
Thank you.
'cause
Yeah, you're welcome.
The
It
style
was for the
points that I needed when winning that match really made me feel even better than I did after beating humans.
Thank you, Stan.
So did you end up set adrifting that said Reality Smasher?
No, what I actually did was set adrift a Thought-Knot Seer and then only kept lands in hand. So when they recast Thought-Knot Seer, they didn't have anything to take. Plus, I got a card off the Thought-Knot Seer leaving the battlefield.
I like it.
It was pretty cool.
Yeah.
Not to mention Chalice was on the board, so I tapped a blue and was starting to do delve stuff, and my opponent wanted to point to their Chalice, and I said, well, actually, this costs 6 mana.
Oh, no. Fine print, sir.
Yeah, so then I played Were Prison, which is another tough matchup for Is It Phoenix, and I want to say this was an instance where I was very lucky again with my opponent's generosity. So this is the one match I had in the tournament that went to time. And on turn 4, after, like I'm telling you guys, I thought I was going to lose. My opponent had made countless Thopters off the top Thopter Foundry combo. They'd gained like upwards of 30 life. On turn 4, this is my last chance. I rip off the top, Shatterstorm, snap play, my opponent scoops on the spot. By all accounts, it would have been a draw, but I was very lucky, and my opponent, being very generous, said, I can't win, I'll give it to you. And I thought that was really cool. And that's something that happens
really
sometimes
cool,
in Comp REL. You can't ever count on it, but like the fact that my opponent did this, I believe I was his third loss of the day or at that point. So he pretty much knew that his journey was over. So he did a really cool thing. So I feel like now I've got to pay it forward. I'm not saying this is something people should do when they play tournaments, but it goes a long way sometimes when they do.
So next time we're playing for a beer, you're going to scoop to me?
If you lock me out of winning, maybe, yeah.
If you go to turns playing for the beer, yeah.
All right, so I had two matchups. They weren't back-to-back, but I had two matchups against Esper Control. And this is the Esper Control list that really popped up at SCG Cleveland. I did not win a single game against them. And I left the tournament feeling like Esper Control is near unbeatable for Izzet Phoenix. I even asked one of my opponents if they can give me any advice for what I should do in the matchup, and they basically said, you just have to get really lucky with Pyromancer's Ascension. I thought Blood Moon would be good, and I even bought a little bit of time with the Blood Moon, but Esper Charm destroys enchantments, so if they time it right and get the right fetches, or get the right basics off their fetches, Blood Moon isn't good enough.
It's almost like Zach mentioned that just the other week.
Yeah, Stan's never heard of me before. He shook his head like he doesn't know a Zach.
I was also going to say it's almost like Zach Allen knew why he wanted to play Esper Charm was because incidentally getting rid of enchantments is pretty good right now.
Yes, my name is Zachary Allen Callahan. We never called me that before, but I guess we can start.
Nice.
Yeah, so I guess one of the takeaways I would provide to our listeners is if you're really struggling with Izzet Phoenix, Esper Control could be a very cromulent strategy for that matchup.
Tired of losing, drop like $1,200 on this deck and beat Izzet Phoenix.
I mean, Kaya alone is the win con.
Yeah,
it's
fair.
crazy. It's crazy what she can do. So yeah, I was really impressed, and obviously after I lost to it, I was like, well, I guess I should buy some Esper Charms because that seems awesome. But last but not least, I want to mention my final round. It was against Spirits. Game 1, I ran away with it really quickly. It wasn't even close. Game 2, same thing for my opponent. And then game 3 was real magic. Like, every decision counted. They would cast creatures, I would cast removal spells. They would bounce my stuff. It was tough. It was hard. I made a mistake. I sided in Blood Moons. I feel like I should never, ever side in Blood Moons against Spirits ever again. But I made just enough right decisions that I got there in the end. My opponent didn't shake my hand, but I knew, he knew, I earned it.
Why not Blood Moon against Spirits?
Yeah, okay, so this is a really good question. I wanted to bounce it off you guys. One of the reasons why I brought Blood Moon in against Spirits is because how strong I have found it against humans, and I often in my brain see those decks almost as analogs, though they are subtly different. And one of the subtle differences I found is that Spirits has some fetches, and likewise Spirits has other basic lands periodically that they could get just enough, along with Noble Hierarchs, to play around a Blood Moon almost no problem. I'll even say one of the reasons why I came to this conclusion is because I've tried in a previous matchup, playing a previous different red deck, bringing Blood Moon in against Spirits, and essentially the same thing happened. And my opponent then said, it's really not that great against me.
Unless they're expecting it, I think you can catch them off guard. But if they're expecting it, then they could fetch up basics. But you don't run more than, if it's Bant Spirits, you don't run more than 3. Was it Blue-White or Bant Spirits?
It was Bant.
Yeah, I mean, they could get lucky and stick a Noble Hierarch or have an Aether Vial and kind of work around the Blood Moon. I think it's worth bringing in.
You do.
I think this echoes back to a statement you made earlier where you were confused about the Deputy of Detention over Reflector Mage. And I think this is a situation where I don't think Blood Moon's good against Spirits, and I think Deputy of Detention contributes greatly to that. Because they can still vial that card in, and it'll just eat that Blood Moon up, and then all of a sudden they're going off. So I think that it is not as... I wouldn't bring in my Blood Moons against Spirits because they have a lot of answers to it, and all it does is momentarily slow them down, and they're a deck that you're not really going to out-tempo via Blood Moon.
So yeah, that all that being said, I came in 10th place, first time cashing a Modern event. That had basically been my goal for the year. this is my third Comp REL Modern event, so I'm glad I got that out of the way. I think my next reasonable goal is to top 8. That's kind of the next progression, evolutionary level I can make as a competitive player. Seems reasonable.
You have gotten to 10th now, so
from 33rd to 10th.
Let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Just find a nice 8-person tournament, and you're there automatically.
I gotta say, it felt pretty weird playing with the Vancouver Mulligan after using London Mulligan online for the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, I hated it. When I had to go back to paper, I was like, no, I don't. I want one more card. I want 2 more cards. Like, I want to see what I can get.
Yeah, the difference between drawing 7 and scrying is just, you don't realize how I don't think I realized how monumental it was until I had to scry again, and I was like, this sucks.
That's hilarious. Well, we're about to find out this weekend what it really feels like for a big tournament to have it, right? So
a big modern tournament to have it, yeah.
Exactly.
Can I throw a little psychology curveball at you guys? I almost didn't play in this tournament at all. So I mentioned briefly in the last episode that I was kind of sick. I'm literally recovering from shingles.
Oh, yeah.
And I woke up on Saturday morning and I'd been feeling really good, but I was like a little iffy. I got to say I was a little iffy, but I got a very encouraging text message from friend of the show, Martin Sheeler, who basically gave me a 3-word pep talk. And I figured, let's do it. And then I did really well. And it made me realize that I've had these instances before where I was like really reluctant to play Magic or go to the LGS. And then I either end up doing really well or like I draft and pull a sweet rare that I needed. And I wonder, have any of you guys ever noticed something like that? Where when you want it least or are the least excited about it, you tend to do better?
Boy, I think that's a tough question. I think for me, if I go into something where I have lowered my expectations and taken the pressure off of myself for performing well and just concentrate on the game, then yeah, I think that does help me sometimes just kind of be in the moment. But I think that's what you're really doing is like giving yourself the freedom to be in the moment and just kind of accept decisions as they come instead of putting a bunch of pressure on. And I feel like that works for me in my professional life and also in gaming to be objective about things. Now, I don't necessarily need to like try to convince myself to not do it in order to get into that space, but maybe that's like kind of how you get there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just kind of ultimately gets down to the decisions, not results type thing for me, right? Like, it's not really answering your question, Stan, but what I'm thinking about right now is just, when I go to a tournament and I don't have an expectation for how well I'm going to do, which is rare. Like, if I go to an LGS and it's a 4-round tournament, I want to go 3-1. I want to leave with some store credit or something like that. But if I can sit down and, like Dave said, play turn to turn, play game to game, focus on making the right decisions, even if the results aren't what you want. That feels like leveling up. You don't make the same mistake you made last week. You don't fetch the wrong land. You make the little micro decisions that add up to results over time. And I think that's when I feel good, is when I realize that I'm making those small level ups that become large level ups in aggregate.
Yeah, really what this question is for me is sort of listening to yourself and understanding where you're coming from. Because I'm someone who has struggled with social anxiety in the past and has sometimes, talked themselves out of doing something that they later regretted or wish they had done. But there are also times where I've pushed myself and just thought that, man, I would have been happier staying home. And I think it's sort of listening to yourself and realizing, am I holding myself back from this, or do I not need to do this? Like, do I need to pay attention to myself and make this about me instead of going out? And I think that's sort of a fine line. And, honestly, Stan, you're someone who's helped me with that, where in the past I've been, I don't know if I'm going to do this. And it's, hey, buddy, come out. It'll be fun. In the end, I'm like, you know what? This was fun. I'm glad I pushed myself. But it's just knowing yourself and knowing where that limit is for you and always putting yourself first in the end.
Yeah, I'm all about looking after number one.
Is that Callahan?
And ignoring everyone else around me, which I know is exactly what you're talking about.
The Comp REL tournament that I top 8'd happened. I got a phone call after the first round that our living room ceiling was leaking. and I had to decide whether I was going to stay home or whether I was going to quit and come home, or if I was going to complete the tournament. I was like, you know what? I'm just going to play till I get X2'd and drop. And I ended up going 8-1 top 8, and then losing in the first round of the top 8. And yeah.
See, I think my lesson there was to go home.
Yeah. And mine was, my deck's okay. I'm going to keep going and see what happens. I was like, I'll quit after this. And then I was showing, 8 hours later, I'm showing Marshall Sutcliffe my deck and going, can you believe I top 8'd with this?
Well, when your back's against the wall with having to go home and deal with a leaking ceiling, you just want to keep playing.
Yeah, true.
I'm really glad I brought this up because that was fascinating. Thank you, guys. I think this wraps up the show for this week.
Another one in the books.
Thank you, as always, to my co-host for the great conversation. And thank you to our listeners for sticking around this long. If you haven't yet, make sure you subscribe to our podcast so you get the latest episode as soon as it comes out. And if you use iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating or review.
Please watch the Mythic Championship this weekend. Get those numbers up. We didn't talk about it much this episode because we talked about it a little bit on the last one, but we're definitely going to be talking about it next week. So please watch the tournament. We'll be watching the tournament. Let's show people how many viewers a Premier Modern event can get.
Oh, yeah. I'm so excited. The group chat's going to be going wild with the speculation and talks about all the plays and everything. So many links shared, so many deck lists talked about. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, unfortunately, I am out next week. Like, I just know I'm going to be out. I'm going on a vacation where I just can't record. So I'm going to have to live vicariously through group chat.
You too can join our group chat if you support us via Patreon. Stay tuned for more details on that. If you'd like to submit a question to the podcast or pick our brain on something in Modern or something you see at the MCQ, tweet us at the Dive Down, all one word. We'll be on Twitter all weekend long. Or you can email thedivedown@gmail.com. If you see us on Reddit, feel free to send a message there as well. As always, special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music. So until next week, get out there and minus a walker! Glad I didn't say banana.
That is one of my favorite jokes to teach little kids because they get so obsessed with saying it over and over and over again. Knock, knock, who's there? Banana. Knock, knock, who's there? Banana.
So I don't know if this will surprise you, but I learned that joke as a child and told it so much that I got grounded.
I think every child has that story.
Like, I was told very kindly to stop telling it, and then I was told not so kindly to stop telling it, and then I got grounded because I did not stop telling that joke.
You know what I did a bunch of times? I said, what's up? And someone would go, what? And I go, chicken butt. What's up? Chicken butt. I did that over and over and over again until I got in trouble, too.
Yeah, same here. I learned that joke as a child, and then I got grounded for shoplifting.
I don't know if those are related. Did you steal oranges and bananas? Did you steal some oranges and bananas, Stan?
No, I stole yo-yos from FAO Schwartz.
I still can't believe we both stole
the
yo-yos.
good yo-yos.
Like I stole a Dunkin' Butterfly from the local CVS thing, and my mom caught me and she made me take it back. It was embarrassing. Here's my ultimate bad boy. Is I used to take frosting containers and then take them up to my room with a spoon and then just eat the frosting, and my mom would discover it eventually.
Why is that a bad boy take?
That's what I did in college for years. It's just me and a tub of frosting and some really sad CDs, low CDs.
And my Betty Crocker.